Well, our next panel of experts believe that collaboration, which we've been hearing about, is key to countering misinformation. But what are the incentives and the strategies needed to join forces? To discuss this and more, please welcome Oreste Pollicino, Krisztina Stump, Zahed Amanullah, and Clement Wolf. Nice to see you all. Thank you very much for being here today. We've heard a lot about disinformation, we've heard about collaboration, we've heard about quality journalism, and what I would like to talk to you about is I guess, the place that legislation plays in all this, and the code of conduct, disinformation, which is, has already been mooted. We know a lot about it. 2018 it came out, strengthened earlier this year. Tell us more, Krisztina, if you could start here. Tell us a little bit more, as your head of unit at the European Commission, how this is going to look when it's implemented. What are your expectations?
So thank you very much for this question. The Commission's expectations towards the code is to become a strong toolbox that can fight disinformation. We have set out our expectations regarding the new code in the guidance that the Commission issued in 2021. These are expectations in which areas the code should be strengthened. Overall, the expectation was to have stronger commitments, to have safeguards that the commitments will be met by the signatories. It was also an expectation to have a broader signatory base, so a true multi-stakeholder approach, also to increase the transparency, and last but not least, to make sure that the code is future-proof.
Future-proof, okay. And Oreste Pollicino, Professor of Constitutional Law at Bocconi University, you chaired the code's negotiations. So what were your main learnings from the process?
Thank you for the questions. I mean, I learned a lot because it was a very innovative methodology, I would say. And we needed to have a formula that should have guaranteed pluralism, a real debate, and at the end, a compromise. This was what we needed, and clearly with the supervision of the European Commission. And what Krisztina said, it was very important. There were different voices that needed to find a common language. It's not always easy, as you can imagine, if you consider civil society on the one hand, the industry on the other one, advertising and fact-checking. So at the end, what I learned, and it was a kind of, I would say, gradual approach. So try first of all, and this is connected to what has been said before, to inject trust among the different voices. Because if one voice or one representative simply doesn't trust the other one, it was very difficult then to find a common language. Once that the things were going well in terms of humus, I don't know if I'm clear, in terms of trust, reciprocal, then it was easier to try to find a common language, and even to do sometimes a step back or a step forward, depending from the perspective, to find a solution, to find an output that at the end I think is quite significant.
Okay, and I know that you're interested in this, Zahed, as being from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Is this something that can work, do you think, having looked at the Code of Conduct?
We think it can. I mean, we were very encouraged, actually. We published a report with recommendations on the 2018 version, and we're really impressed to see that many of those concerns have been addressed. You've got 44 commitments up from 21. You've got this commitment to transparency and a transparency center where people, researchers like ourselves and others who are interested in finding out the impact of this data, not only have access to the data, but also contextualize information on how that data is used. That's really important. And also what's really important is that you have the impending Digital Services Act coming out, which provides a framework for compliance. I think this is, all the pieces have sort of fallen together at the right moment, you know, where we have the framework, a long period of consultation and discussion. You've had 33 plus, companies sign up to this in terms of a commitment to abide by the principles. Now that's going to be pushed forward into a baseline sort of status of each company in terms of compliance with those. You've got KPIs that are defined. So there's so many factors here which speak to the process. Like you just mentioned, it's an iterative process, and I think that countries like the UK and the US are watching very carefully here to see how this process is playing out. And in this sense, we're doing the heavy lifting here, but I think it looks very promising.
Okay, Clement, from your perspective at Google, do you worry when you see a code of conduct on disinformation? Do you think, right, I hear obligations and I see legislation and that puts us in a difficult position?
I think it was a very novel process, so I don't think worry is the right framework here. It was more a sense of wondering how we approach this new object, which didn't really exist as such before the Commission laid out this new framework for deliberating on this instrument. And we've engaged with it, I feel, pretty meaningfully throughout the year, first before its signature and its drafting. And since then, I think all of those who are in the room and in the audience online should know, the work continues. We're not just, it's not a one and done where we all walk away and go back home and just call it a day. It is the fact that we have a permanent task force where many of us in the room and beyond continue to meet several times a week to discuss open questions, make sure that we're well calibrated on expectations, that we acknowledge the challenges we encounter in compliance, but also make long-term plans for addressing them. And all in all, have, I think, what is one of the most meaningful advances of this code, which is a structured mechanism for dialogue and exchange and hopefully over time cooperation between very different constituencies that have very strong interests and care for this issue. Okay. And I think it's been very helpful so far.
So that's the bringing together of the different institutions, all with a common goal, which is to try to defeat disinformation. But what, Krisztina, will the Code of Conduct actually look like in practice? What will institutions be expected to do?
I would say that the code of practice is actually already a reality. So we are already in the implementation phase, and all the signatories need to do their job, basically. The signatories, the platforms have to implement their commitments to the measures in place. They have to work together in the task force to make sure that the missing elements are there. And the European Commission's task is to watch whether the signatories live up to their commitments and look into the reports that are upcoming to see how the code is delivering.
But what are the measures? What are people expected to live up to? What will you be looking out for?
Maybe just to give an overview or an idea what kind of tools are in this toolbox, because I think it's important to stress that the code doesn't define one silver bullet that will make this information disappear. Yeah. However, it has several tools in it that need to be implemented by the signatories that altogether can have an effect to reduce disinformation. This has been already mentioned before today, but maybe to explain a bit, demonetization of disinformation to make sure that advertising is not supporting disinformation, then giving users tools to recognize disinformation, to have a context of it, to flag disinformation, and we expect obviously signatories to follow up on these leads. Then also fact-checking is an important aspect, has been also discussed today, and also measures against manipulative behavior or giving researchers access to data to understand more the phenomenon of disinformation.
Okay. Yes.
And if I may add something on this.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. What I found important is that in a way we were lucky during the process, because the huge difference with the code of 2018, it was that at the time there was not a roadstar, there was not something to look at. In this case, we had the guidance of the European Commission. What does it mean? It means simply that we knew that there was what we call red line, something that it was simply impossible to go below. This was very important. There was also another lucky circumstance that we knew that in few years would have come into force the DSA, that basically is making the code of practice a shift from a self-regulation exercise to a more co-regulation. So we worked as it was already enforced. It was not enforced, but everybody in the room knew that it was better to do now the job than then later having the enforcement.
So you've got the Digital Services Act, you've got the Code of Practice, which it would be a good idea for everyone to sign up to, is what you're saying.
Exactly. There was a good incentive, I would say.
We're not compelling you.
Not compelling at the moment, but for sure, you know that it's better to do their job right now than then later pay the consequence.
Okay, Zahed, not compelling you now, but so what do you think about the Code of Practice? And it's sort of, it's voluntary, but I really would suggest that you do it.
Well, this is sort of an example of letting society have a say in how these companies operate. I mean, is this perfect? No. And the point of it being an iterative process, a consultative process, a collaborative multi-sector process, that's what will hopefully make it work. I mean, and for the companies, for example, that haven't signed on, Apple and Amazon, there's a strong incentive for them to sort of figure out a way to be involved, because ultimately consumers, users of this information will look at this and judge for themselves whether this is benefiting their lives or not. And of course, they're the market, right? These are all private companies. Ultimately, they have to answer to the users. So a strong argument has now been put in place for real action on disinformation. And with the signatories now committed to at least, to meeting us, halfway down the road, let's see what happens. There'll be another discussion after that, and we can talk about changes or modifications after. But it's important that the process starts. We've spent so much time debating and discussing what this framework looks like, and while other countries are still debating, we're doing it here, and that's important.
And Clement, what does it look like when you're implementing these proposals? Because you have signed up to this Code of Practice. Have you signed up to all of it? Is Google alongside?
Yes, we have signed to not all of it. There are specific sections that will apply to our services in the same way, but I would say the vast majority of it. The signing forms, by the way, are public, so of course anyone can go out and see for themselves which specific measures we have signed up for. But what it looks like right now is a lot of work for a lot of people who are not in this room right now, but trying to meet all of the very demanding standards put forward by the code in terms of both continuing to improve on things like tackling inauthentic behaviors or user empowerment, as Krisztina mentioned, but also transparency, the amount of detailed reporting that is required under the code, public reporting across Europe is pretty high and pretty novel. It also involves a good amount of partnerships with the ecosystem, whether it's with fact checkers or with researchers or with others. That's also quite a lot of work for many people. And finally, I should mention again this permanent task force, which may or may not sound like it is a lot, but it is actually the first time, I believe, that we have this mechanism for ongoing conversations among the community on these issues about the code, but also things like crisis response and other issues. So all of that work is happening right now. It will continue to happen over time. It may or may not surprise you to hear that it's not an on-off switch that we can press to trigger all of this happening overnight. So we have teams building reporting pipelines. We have teams exploring partnership models and whatnot. But this will, of course, the first report is due January, and then we'll keep iterating upon that over time.
I mean, it's resource heavy, isn't it?
It is.
You've got to employ presumably a lot more moderators. Not all online platforms are increasing their moderators. What do you think about, and Zahed, I'll address this question to you. I mean, it's okay, I guess, for the very large online platforms to say, we can adhere to all this because we can put all the systems in place because we have the resources. What about those areas that don't?
Well, I mean, this is where the task force comes in. This is where, you have the cross-platform, sort of conversation. There's been a parallel effort to do this on extremism and terrorism with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. So this conversation can take place where smaller platforms, smaller companies can either learn or sort of share resources to try to make that happen. I mean, the elephant in the room is, we're speaking in the same week that Twitter has essentially shuttered its Brussels office. So the real question about compliance is going to loom large over the next 6 months. But also, I think it's important to understand, from 2018 to now, in 4 years, how much the disinformation landscape has evolved. In that we had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had obviously the technology changing and trends changing. So we've learned so much in the last 4 years that's applying to this. It's not just 4 years of sort of just talking amongst ourselves. We've really learned a lot. So now's the time to sort of, at least, for those who can comply, who have the resources, let's get moving and do that.
Right.
And we'll try to solve those other problems later.
Yeah, and you mentioned Twitter and the closing of the Brussels office, and also perhaps not having as many moderators as they had in the past. Krisztina, what kind of challenge does that pose?
Overall, let me just also remind in that context that all the signatories that have signed up to the code made also a commitment to put the adequate financial and human resources in place to live up to their commitment. So this commitment is very important indeed. So we shall see at the first reporting, like for other signatories, if they comply. Maybe just to jump in also regarding proportionality, smaller players, bigger players, because I mentioned that the Commission wanted deliberately a code that is not just a code for the big platforms, because this information is not just out there. Also other players have to contribute, and there we expect proportionality. So we don't expect the same from very large online platforms than from smaller players. Also, fact-checkers can contribute in a different way than other players. So basically, the idea of the code is to get as many on board as possible, but the burden should be proportionate, and everybody should contribute in the way that they can, depending on their capacity.
And Oreste, if the expectation is that the smaller players don't have to produce as much, where does that leave disinformation if it's some of the smaller players which are producing the disinformation?
Yeah, basically, the idea is again to try to find one of the key principles in the European constitutional law, that is proportionality. So, in a way, we didn't know exactly how the things then would have developed, but we knew for sure that would have been unfair at the beginning to put the same burden, the same obligation on a platform that simply have different sides, a different source. So we knew that it was very important to work on this, I would say, proportionality and not discrimination, no? Because this is also in a way resulting in the answer to the questionnaire, because there is a simplified one for the let's say, less big platform. But I would like to add a footnote to what you said about content moderation. Because content moderation today in Europe, it's really the key in order to comply not only with the SA, but also with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So we should remember, and I think we should not neglect the preamble of the code. You know, the preamble in general is not binding, but it's a good roadster. If you read the preamble, you will see many times one word: dignity. And dignity is the European matrix that is, I would say, the result of common constitutional traditions in Europe vis-à-vis liberty United States. So why I'm saying this? Because if you, as it's happening in some social network, basically are eliminating the content moderation policy, the risk is basically that artificial intelligence or automation process will deprive what is simply impossible to substitute, the human choice. I just give you an example and then I will shut up. When there was when there was the pandemic season, there was a period in which the fact checkers and the human being employed were forced to stay home. And then there was something saying fact checkers stayed home and content go down. Why? Because in that period, exactly in that period, without the content moderation, it was very easy to risk the over removal. And then you basically harm one of the most important rights in Europe, in European constitutional law, but I would say in general constitutional law, freedom of expression.
Yes, freedom of expression. And Clement, that is the tension though, isn't it? There is a tension there between the freedom of expression and also the need to clamp down on misinformation.
Yes, there is one.
How do you navigate that?
Well, it's one of these tensions that can only be resolved with a yes and. We have to do both. We have no choice but to focus on both. The asset we have here as an online service, a set of online services, I should say, is that the levers we have, which were discussed in some of the earlier panels to act on these issues, are not as binary as either remove or don't remove. There's a lot that can be done and which the code actually encourages to focus on contextualization, elevating authoritative information, or reducing the spread of borderline content. That does not deprive anyone from the right to say their piece or for information to be found if someone wants to find it, but makes sure that we as a service do the best we can to empower people who come to us for information with the best we're able to provide them.
But when you're making those choices, it's humans that are best able, is it not, to make those choices? To decide what you leave online, what you take down?
Indeed. So whenever we do have policies that dictate the removal of content, then I could go in a very lengthy elaboration on these policies, which I won't do because thankfully you don't deserve that. It's way too burdensome. But the important point is, for policies about things like misinformation, which are context heavy, AI is not good enough to understand where a comment is made in jest, when it's satire, when it's meant to denounce something, or when it's meant to endorse it, and it may not make a difference between different cultural settings. So AI systems are really good at helping our trust and safety teams detect leads. They can line up sets of content that are worth reviewing and looking into. What they cannot do well is make that final call on this sort of policies. For some policies they can. If you look at spam, for instance, very technical stuff, or we can evidentiate coordination, for instance, that's a little easier. But for things that rely upon such understanding of cultural context, you have to have humans in the loop, and that's why it's hard to, in our jargon, scale. And that's why these other levers, which are using ranking systems, using context at scale, the kind of media literacy campaigns we discussed earlier today are so important because they scale much better and they provide more opportunities for us as a set of services to benefit our users in that way.
Okay. We're calling for questions, and we've got a question from our online audience from Paul Kilkenny, and it's a question for the Commission. What does success of the Code of Practice and the DSA, the Digital Services Act, in relation to misinformation and disinformation look like? For example, an earlier speaker stated that EDMO discovered EDMO. Just fill me in. EDMO.
European Digital Media Observatory.
European
Digital Media Observatory.
Thank you very much. Discovered 1,600 instances of disinformation. 1,600 instances of disinformation. That's one for you, Krisztina.
Sure. So from the Commission's perspective, obviously, success looks like if the code is implemented and the measures put in place, that can reduce disinformation. At the same time, I would be very worried if one day I wake up and there is no disinformation out there. Then I think we arrived at the stage when we are over-regulating. I profoundly believe that this is not the case. And also, let me also chip in regarding the freedom of speech. I actually don't see any conflict between the code and the freedom of speech because the code's measures are not targeting removal. Is it against the freedom of speech if independent fact-checkers check content and indicate that it may not be true? Is it against the freedom of speech if advertisers don't support with their money disinformation content? Or is it against the freedom of speech to remove fake accounts or bots that are spreading disinformation? So I think we found the right mix. I think there should not be an expectation to have no disinformation out there, but we would like to see the impact, indeed, of the code.
Zahed, you wanted to come in on this.
If I could just add to that. I mean, one of the roles of independent researchers is to find out also what this success looks like. In our research on disinformation, it's not just about the messages, it's also about the instigators, the state and non-state actors, the networks, the individuals. In some cases, it's a very small group of individuals that are promoting a lot of disinformation with a wide reach. With these measures in place, we'll be able to continue that research and continue to see if those networks are disrupted. So not just the messaging and the impact on the end user, but those networks. We'll be looking for that very carefully because if those networks are disrupted, then we have a good idea that possibly other sources of disinformation are also being disrupted.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions in the audience here in our in-person audience here in Brussels? If there are, please put your hand up, and we'll get a microphone to you. Okay, while we wait for those, I've just got one more online question, and this is from Anupam Pandey in our online audience. Are there any measures where civil society influencers can collaborate with agencies or policy bodies to ensure quality of content and flag the inappropriate? I guess this is also back to you and to also Clement. Should we start with Clement?
Sure thing. And thank you so much for the question. I obviously, I want to make sure I understand it well, but as I take it, this is about understanding whether civil society can play a role in first flagging of disinformation and second, helping set the standards for what is welcome or unwelcome. I would say certainly the code does have provisions about the flagging of content on online services. Signatories have to have policies that address the risks of disinformation. They have to be transparent about these policies, and they have to enable users to flag content under these policies. So that's a part of it. And civil society, just like anyone else, can of course use these tools to report disinformation. Insofar as the notion of deciding what constitutes quality content, that's always going to be a little different depending on the service. What makes sense on one social media may not make sense on another search engine, and so on and so forth. But first of all, the code does provide, again, via the Permanent Task Force, a venue for discussion on all of these topics, where feedback can be shared, where explanations can be provided, where there can be some sort of a dialogue. And second, I would say most services I'm aware of, though certainly not all, do consult with civil society, with experts, and so on and so forth, as they elaborate their policies, precisely so as to understand what are the considerations that these experts would raise and how to make sure to factor them in.
When all is said and done, this whole process will help minimize disinformation. It will not eliminate it. And I think we need to be very, very clear that it's like we're talking about the war on terror. It's like these things won't go away. We're just trying to control it and manage it. And so for that disinformation that does get through, civil society has a huge role to play. Especially as they're often the victims of this disinformation, especially if you're a targeted minority, for example. So I've got some, lots of anecdotes where we work with civil society organizations in pre-bunking, which was mentioned earlier today in Yasmin's talk, or providing advice on filling the vacuum of narratives that are used by people who are, purveying disinformation about specific target groups, whether it's anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, you name it. And there are real examples of where this could be successful, but it's on a case-by-case basis for individual communities, which, of course, when you multiply that across society, that does become another challenge. But, it would be nice if that challenge was minimized through this process. Then we can focus on solving those problems.
Okay. Yes, Krisztina.
And maybe just to add that it's also important in this context that civil society organizations are also among the signatories of the code, so they are part of this community, part of the task force. They are involved in the discussions, for example, how to reduce disinformation regarding Ukraine, and obviously we expect the signatories, online platforms and so on to take their concerns seriously in this regard, and I think this is an important part of the multi-stakeholder approach that we are speaking about here.
Oreste?
And if I may, there is also a legal basis on this, that is the recital, that now are always more important in the case law of the Court of Justice. The recital, now I don't want to sound legally and boring, but it's the recital 90 of the SA, that in the mitigating risk activity of the platforms ask for the involvement of civil society. So we have a legal basis there that we can use in a way to inject even more civil society participation.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions in the room. If we can get a microphone first to Jumper Gray over here, or if you can't, to a microphone. There we go. If you could just reach back and get your microphone. Thank you. If you could say who you are, where you're from, who you want your question to be addressed to, that would be great.
Thanks. My name is Andriy Kusem, represent Let's Data Ukrainian startup. So I think the question mainly would be to Krisztina, but I think in general, I think disinformation strives where in the shadows where communication doesn't reach, and we've spoken a lot about the platforms and spoken a lot about civil society, but there is also communication in the public sector, public communication. And I think often what we see right now is quite ineffective. I mean, it's not data-driven. It's like 21% of them use data-driven approaches. So right now, with this code of conduct, there will be a lot of interesting data on which topics are sensitive, but what cooperation with the public communication and PR departments is planned so they could jump in and basically try to shadow the light and be more effective in their communication.
That's a really good point. Thank you very much about misinformation existing often in the shadows, and it's not necessarily in the large platforms that you expect. So how can you encourage that cooperation and get into those shadows in order to get to the disinformation, Krisztina?
I believe that here the work of the European Digital Media Observatory is very important, because I think you already heard about it today. It is basically composed also of national hubs with researchers, fact-checkers, media literacy specialists that look also into the lay of the land. They look in every member state from next year on to see what is the landscape regarding disinformation, what is the overall communication space. And I think their contribution from the ground can indeed provide very useful insight to use this also strategically.
Yes, Clement first.
Did you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. In addition to Kristina's points, and thank you so much for the question, I do hope that some of the work that's suggested by the code on things like media literacy, user empowerment, benefits people not just on any one service, but across the board. Rasmus Nielsen, who was here earlier today, has done some interesting research on and he's not the only one, on the fact that few people are stuck to any one online service, right? So if, let's say, YouTube does a media literacy campaign, the benefits of it are not restricted to people, to a certain class of people who would only use YouTube. People who use YouTube tend to also use other social media platforms, other messaging apps, and so on and so forth. So there's work we can do with public communications, especially as he mentioned, public communications with civil society leaders, with creators that are trusted, to make sure that as many communities are reached with important messages, and that's something that we have tried to be deliberate about throughout the COVID pandemic and throughout the Ukraine crisis, notably with the great work that Yasmin talked about earlier today on pre-bunking, but also that we can all do more of in the future, I think.
Okay.
If I could just add to that really quickly, I mean, we're stepping out of the sort of talk about organizations and civil society and so forth. One of the most effective countering of disinformation with the Ukraine war has been a movement, a decentralized movement called the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, not attributed to any organization, 20,000 plus volunteers online, going right at it and debunking the disinformation as it comes from any corner of the internet, garnering the support of obviously Ukrainian officials in the defense ministry and elsewhere. So if we think outside the box a little bit, you know, allowing people to organically combat disinformation is another facet of this we haven't really considered. Just not in the framework of this legislation, but it's an interesting facet.
Yeah, it is, and interesting points from both, which is, you know, anyone can use the resources that some of the bigger online platforms produce in order to combat misinformation and disinformation, and that I guess, I don't know, approaches to combat it might not come from there, they might come from other places, and we need more imaginative approaches. There is another question I think at the back there, yes.
Thank you so much. Because the DSA and also the code of conduct were thought as a future-proof piece of legislation or measure, and that is a term that was used also from representatives of .Europe, for example, this lawmaking organization that call this way the e-commerce directive. So we are trying to have legislation for the next 20 years. So my question is on two things. One is already established as, and the question is how beneficial do you see it combined, consolidated with the code? The first one is the structure of oversight board, because we can see now incentive to be replicated in another platform, probably other platforms. So do you see that beneficial structure that is attached to the platform as an independent body? And the second one is still a concept, the middleware of content curation. When you're designing the DSA and when you're designing the code, how you can see it working in different environments. For example, the middleware concept of Francis Fukuyama, that is this layer in between the content creators and the platforms. Thank you.
So the DSA and the Code of Practice Working Together, that you're asking, does it, the Oversight Board, and is it independent? Is there an independent body?
It is presented as independent. We know how it is structured, but is it seen as something beneficial, a platform to have as an additional structure that is safeguarding human rights, that is a redressing mechanism, but it's also taking decisions related to the policy?
Clement.
Thank you.
Sure thing. First of all, thank you so much for the questions. I think they're very important. So to try to answer them briefly, on the Oversight Board, I'm assuming you're referring to the Oversight Board set up by Meta specifically. So for those of you who would not be familiar with it, it is a mechanism set up, I believe, by Meta, and we have someone from Meta in the room who can talk about it more later, which is designed to provide appeal for content decisions by Facebook and have final say on content decisions by Facebook. I put it very briefly, but that's the crux of it. I believe what's the kernel of this is very important for most platforms, which is the idea that there should be some sort of expert consultation and engagement in the design of policies, and then some feedback loop with the enforcement of them. And I think we all do this a little differently. Meta's Oversight Board is one approach. There are others, but the notion of having this consistent conversation with experts around the world and across the European Union to better understand what equities we should consider when developing policies, what are the impacts of enforcement, what we're missing, that's fundamental to us, and I think we are very keen to see that going forward. As for your second question about middleware, here I think it's a user choice question. How do you empower people to have more agency on what they see online? And here too, I think there's no one size fits all. I think different services have different heuristics. One key question, of course, with all of these user choice issues, whether it's middleware or something else, is the more you let users self-select some things, the more it is possible for them to inadvertently self-select harmful things. So there's a balancing act to be had. But I think in general, there is a lot to be done in enabling users to have meaningful agency on what content they want to access. I think search engines do that very well, for instance, whilst also making sure to give them every opportunity to access content and to see content that is authoritative, reliable, and helpful to them.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions as well. Oreste, is there a tension here between sort of giving people enough choice that they can look at what they want to look at, but not too much choice so that they go to places you don't want them to go?
I mean, there is the risk, for sure, and it's very difficult to find the right balancing. But what I would like to add, because it's very interesting for me, in relation to the Oversight Board, because I would distinguish two different situations. The first one is migration of constitutional ideas. The second is hybridization. I will try to be more clear. Migration, it means it might be a mistake. When constitutional ideas migrate from United States to Europe, then could be what I call reject crisis, just to be very practical. When in 2018 there was the idea to import in Europe the idea of free marketplace of ideas, we were speaking before in the morning, it didn't work. Why? Because this is a typical United States American idea of freedom of expression. It doesn't work in Europe, because Europe has different constellation of rights. This I call migration. But in the Oversight Board, what is interesting is what I call hybridization, because you have a body that is basically based in the United States, but is using, in order to assess its adjudication power. For example, look at the platforming decision against Trump. It's using principle from European law, like proportionality, like reasonable approach. And this is interesting because basically you have a kind of hybridization between the American and the European language. And this might really help to build a transatlantic bridge. It's impossible to have a common language because there are different values, but at least there is a lower risk to be lost in translation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's room for optimism.
Yes, I would say that there is.
Okay, and you all agree?
Yeah.
Yeah? Tentatively, it seems?
Tentatively.
Oh, for sure.
We will be watching closely.
You'll be watching closely. Okay. Thank you very much, Krisztina, and thank you to Oreste, thank you to Zahed, and thank you to Clement as well. Thanks to our panel. You can stay where you are. That's fine. Yeah, thank you.